I have an honor to have Professor Kenneth Rogoff with me. Professor Kenneth Rogoff is a professor of economics at Harvard University. He has a huge stature in the subject of economics. He has published a number of books, very famous books, path-breaking books, and he has a large number of articles published in the top-ranked journals in the subject of economics. Another introduction of Professor is that he is an international grandmaster of chess. Professor, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, or good evening.
Yes, good evening here. Professor, let's start on the very lighter note that chess, economy, IMF, Harvard University, which one is difficult and how all these things are related?
They're all difficult and they're all interesting. I'd say one common thread, at least in my mind, is that chess involves strategic thinking and really some elements of game theory. So when I turn to doing economic research, I'm not necessarily nearly as fast as many of my students at doing formal mathematics, but game theory, which can be quite technical, came very naturally to me. I could sort of, see how to think about it. And I think some of my most important papers make use of game theory. Certainly when I worked as chief economist and director of research at the IMF, it was during a period of many crises, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay. This was in the early 2000s, and much else. A global recession, I should have mentioned, the bursting of the dot-com bubble. Some of your listeners and viewers may be too young to remember that, but that was quite a big recession in the early 2000s. And I found that one of the experiences I got from playing chess was learning to stay calm, that everybody makes mistakes. Everybody says something wrong sometimes. We all make mistakes. We're human. And you need to stay calm after you make a mistake, or try to remember clearly what you're thinking. And I found that very useful at the IMF, to just remember we're human. We have to regroup and recalibrate. And in many meetings and in thinking about a lot of problems, I found that very helpful.
That's great. Professor, you have written a lot of things about the financial globalization, and the people have taught us about a number of things about the direct benefits of the globalization of the financial things. But you have mentioned some indirect benefits of the financial globalization. Can you please explore a bit more for us, what type of these indirect benefits of the financial globalizations?
Yeah, so this may sound rather abstract, but most people think about globalization. They think about trade, being able to buy stocks around the world, being able to borrow from abroad. And they think of that as the big benefit of globalization. And it's very, very important. But another important benefit of globalization is it communicates best practice, good ideas, and I should emphasize changing ideas, not necessarily something that's constant. And I think that's a very big benefit. Central banks is actually an interesting example. My understanding is actually that the Central Bank of Pakistan is recently being considered to have more formal independence. And central banks around the world have been sharing their practice. And I think that's helped improve financial regulation, importantly, bring down inflation all over the world. And that's just an example of sharing ideas. They're ideas in business. And it also, financial globalization puts a little bit of a check on governments, because if you're bringing in foreign firms or you want to invest abroad, you need to think a little bit about how they're going to feel when you take actions that you might, get away with if you just had to deal with domestic residents. So those are some of the indirect benefits.
Can we link these indirect benefits with the digital economy or the cryptocurrency? Because nowadays there is a huge talk in Pakistan about the cryptocurrencies. And are you thinking about that the cryptocurrencies is making to a new bubble, the new financial bubble, or not? Because the amount of transaction has been mounting a lot.
Cryptocurrencies is a fascinating new area of globalizations, digital currencies, central bank currencies. And it poses challenges and opportunities that we haven't really seen before. I mean, the opportunities are very clear that we live in this world of dollar dominance where it can be very expensive to do international transactions, where there are all kinds of regulations. And I'm an American, but I know even my colleagues in Europe and policymakers I know in Europe, not to mention China and elsewhere, chafe at the amount of power that the US gets from dollar dominance, and also the profits that the US gets from dollar dominance. And it's not just that everybody uses the dollar, it's that they use what we call the rails of they control the rails of the international system. In other words, all the things behind the scenes that you don't see when you make a transaction. You make say a debit card payment or credit card payment or cash electronic transfer to another business, even giving it to one of your friends. There's all sorts of a system that it goes through. And because the dollar is so dominant, it also has been the case that the US controls a lot of levers of that. So of course, it's very attractive to have means of doing transactions that go outside this system, not just because it doesn't share information the same way, but because it could potentially be cheaper. But it's not so simple. For example, if you look at cryptocurrencies, there's no question that Bitcoin, for example, is being used to send remittances. Say if someone from Pakistan is working abroad and they want to send money back to their parents, it's a very inexpensive way of doing it for many people compared to Western Union and some of the alternatives. But the downside, I think, for everyone, not just for the United States, is that these transactions are not so easy to trace. They're not so easy to follow. In fact, they're very costly. And so it's a way of evading taxes, regulations, and of course, we can also be talking about crime, drug trafficking. So it's a wild west and it presents opportunities, but there need to be regulations. We can go on to talk about central bank digital currencies, which are not the same animal because they're inside the tent, they're inside the regulations. But one final thing about the regulation of digital currencies and Bitcoin, it really needs to be a broad effort. If just, say, Japan were to ban cryptocurrency use in transactions and payments, it doesn't really matter much because you can use it anywhere. You can even if you could hold Bitcoin in Japan, say that were still legal, then you can still send it in seconds, well, 10 or 15 minutes to someone abroad to spend. So if you want to constrain the space, you need international cooperation. And I think that's one of the reasons the cryptocurrency community is skeptical that regulation is coming, because you really need a good deal of international cooperation.
Good. But once Joseph Stiglitz says that the Bitcoin should be banned because it has no social no social value and no social useful. What is your take on this quote of Joseph Stiglitz?
Well, I half agree and half disagree. Of course, I said that long ago, something like that, in my 2016 book on the past, present, and future of currency, that eventually governments are going to find that these pseudonymous currencies just allow too much activity outside their purview. And for all the good that freedom and privacy is, they need to be substantially regulated and reined in. But I disagree that they serve no purpose. The example of remittances is certainly a socially useful purpose. The average cost, according to the World Bank, of people sending remittances, the tens of millions of workers around the world sending money back to their relatives, is, on the order of 8 or 10% for every dollar that you want to send. Those are huge costs. If some people pay 15 or 20%, and it's not free with cryptocurrencies, but it can be really as little as a few percent. And that's just an example. And certainly, there are uses, but of course, there are a lot of uses that don't serve a social purpose. And that's the problem. And I think we could move to a world where we had options that were much better than we have, that allow people to send remittances inexpensively, for example, without necessarily wildly, freely allowing everything else. But, it's difficult. So I'm actually in favor, this may sound rather radical, but I'm in favor of banning Bitcoin in the United States and the advanced economies. I don't think it is in their interest to have them. That's not necessarily true for everybody. So, certainly, for example, if you're a country under US financial sanctions, why should you want to ban Bitcoin? Because it suits the convenience of the United States.
Are you thinking or looking that the Bitcoin or the cryptocurrencies is going to be a medium of exchange in the next 10 years, or would it be the obsolete? What is the future of cryptocurrency? What do you think?
Well, digital currencies are in the future, and they're really, let's divide them very crudely into two kinds: digital currencies that are permissioned and the government can fairly easily see them, and these pseudonymous currencies, which they can't. So I don't think there's any question that digital currencies are just going to become more and more important. And I think there are ways to allow privacy in small transactions that are going to take time to iron out, take time to navigate, that are coming. I don't think it's easy to have Bitcoin used in small transactions. I mean, we're talking about, buying a beer or something, because the transactions cost is just huge. The volatility is just huge. If you're carrying around some Bitcoin, it could be worth 20% less in a day. I mean, the volatility is just spectacular. So I don't think it's going to become a medium of exchange. Rather, it's an alternative for the shadow economy, really, is what it is at the moment. But it is used in transactions. I think those people who say, oh, it's just for investment, it does nothing else, I think if that were the case, it really wouldn't be worth anything. I think it has utility, but again, it's a complex issue how you evaluate that utility. If you're a government trying to prevent drug trafficking and human trafficking, collect taxes, regulations, you may have a rather grim view of it. If you're someone who sees the government as infringing on your rights or preventing you from doing something you should be able to do, and there are certainly things like that, then you have a whole different view.
As you are mentioning that it is the future, the digital money is the future of the world, then what is the role of the central bank, and what is the role of the commercial banks, and how the commercial banks and the central banks will coordinate, and what will be the future of the monetary policy?
You're asking a very deep question that all the central banks are trying to ask. I think every central bank has realized if they don't have their own digital currency, they at least need to put their imprint on this space. It is booming. What are the regulations? And the central banks have been very slow to lay out what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And there's some very technical questions here that I certainly can't get my head wrapped around. I asked some of my students and colleagues who are more expert at cryptographics and computer science. So the governments are not only thinking about these economic issues, but some rather technical issues that are, I would have to say, still being sorted out. But one economic issue that I think is becoming clearer over time is when some people talk about a central bank digital currency, they're just thinking the central bank issues digital currency, and that's what everybody wants. You put your money in the central bank instead of putting your money in a commercial bank. And there's certainly people who I think have very naively said, this is just a wonderful idea, we should do it tomorrow, and have all these ideas about great things the government could do if it could print money like this. I think it's naive because it's going to just destroy the banking system. And I have progressive friends and colleagues who think that's great, but I think that's naive. I think that we need the banking system to make loans, to keep commerce going. You can't just replace it overnight. You can replace the standard deposit. You could really have the technology to let people deposit at the central bank, but you have to have a way for it to go back out into the economy. I think there's also a secondary issue that if you concentrate everything in one place, that might be making the financial infrastructure more prone to disaster than if you have something that's more decentralized. And also along those lines, we have banking systems that for all their failings and all the bank runs and all the financial crises, they've been pretty durable to cyber attacks and other things. I knock on wood, we say, that I hope something terrible doesn't happen. And then if you were to just replace this overnight with this great system that the central bank thinks that it figured out, and it turned out they didn't think enough moves ahead on technological change, you could suddenly quickly get into trouble. But another aspect that I think central banks are realizing is that they want to try to find a way to preserve what they call a two-tier system. So right now, think about it as the central bank prints money and bank reserves, which the banks use, and then the banks interface with us, our businesses, individuals. And they'd like to preserve that, or to be honest, it's not that they want to have that 100 years from now. I'm not sure what we'll have even 40 or 50 years now, but you don't just want to change everything overnight if you're not absolutely sure what you're replacing it for. That's a surefire recipe to have a financial crisis. So on the one hand, the central banks are hearing all these views, you have to do something. The cyber currency, Ripple, Ethereum, Bitcoin, everything's booming, stable coins. Where are you? What are you doing? And they do need to take a presence in this space, but I think they have to be careful not to just immediately push everything out of the way. They need to find their place in this system that can evolve. It can look different in 40 or 50 years, but I think anyone who thinks we can just get rid of all the banks tomorrow, and I have friends who want that, I think it's just very naive.
Put one more thing. If the big tech companies like the Google, Amazon, or Facebook, or like that, if they issue their own digital currency, would the system will be more complex?
Another very fundamental question, and this came up in a big way when Facebook announced it was going to issue a cryptocurrency or a digital currency. I don't want to get into technical details. It's really interesting that until that point, when central banks and regulators looked at the system, they said, well, we know it's being used for some purposes we don't like, but it's small. We don't think it's that big a deal. There seems to be a lot of innovation. Let's let them figure things out and then we'll move in. But when Facebook came to the table with its, 2 billion users, its vast economic resources, and said, Facebook's going to stand behind a digital currency, I think that really woke central banks up into action. What they've done so far really is to make it impossible for Facebook to do what it wants to do. Facebook's not in the shadow economy. They very much have to run in the legal economy. And when the central banks and the regulators say, don't do this, we're going to punish you, they eventually had to back down. We could go into the long stories, and I have to mention, I have several students who I didn't push them to do this, got
Mm.
interested in working in this space. But that's just a taste of what's to come as digital currencies get bigger. And my own opinion is the central banks and regulators are already very, very far behind the curve, especially in the United States. They're like a deer caught in the headlights. That's a phrase we have. They just have no idea what's going on, what's coming. The Super Bowls are a big sporting event. It's the football championship. You could have called it the Cyber Bowl. They had so many ads for cryptocurrencies. Matt Damon, who's a famous actor in many, many movies, is there telling people everybody should buy cryptocurrency. They really need to crack down on this, and they should have done it yesterday. But I don't know if it's coming. I really don't. I think it eventually will, but I don't know when.
Just one more question on cryptocurrency. What would be the value, the importance, and the role of gold if all this happens?
I sometimes say gold is the new gold, because everybody says, just cryptocurrencies like gold. No, it's not like gold. Gold's been around for 5,000 years. It's deeply ingrained in our cultural traditions. And I think there's a very important role for gold in the international system. And I've actually, said to central banks at emerging markets for 20 plus years that, boy, you seem to be holding a lot of dollars. The advanced countries hold a lot of their reserves in gold. Did you think about holding more gold? And of course, that's happening. A number of central banks are moving more into that. I wouldn't say just gold. It's expensive to hold. But I think gold will long have a role in the financial system. And I think during times of duress, I think people very well understand this. And certainly in Asia, which has had, political and economic turmoil over the years, the people very, very well understand that gold still has an important role to play.
Let's come to Asia. You wrote a fantastic book, The Curse of Cash. The less cash economy, or the cashless economy. Then India demonetized. They demonetized the biggest denomination of 2,000 and the 1,000 rupee note. Do you advise us that we Pakistani should demonetize the biggest denomination of rupee 5,000, which is equivalent to about $30 USD dollar? The argument is the same: the reduction of the corruption and the FATF and the money laundering and blah blah blah. Would it be disaster, or would it be the work for us?
Actually, my book was very cautious in saying getting rid of large notes, $50, $100 bills, 1,000 Swiss franc notes, is something the advanced countries are ready to undertake, because they have a lot of financial inclusion. They have a very well-developed electronic systems. I explicitly say in the book, I don't recommend this anytime soon for emerging markets or developing economies, which are very cash reliant and do not have the financial infrastructure. And you notice I mentioned $50 and $100 notes. I would also say, I said, if you think about doing this, don't do it overnight. You need to take 5 to 7 years to phase out the largest note, another 10 years, the next largest note. You have to do this very gradually, because it's potentially very disruptive. And I think it was very naive of the Indian government to believe they would catch all the criminals by insisting the money come out right away. And I think I explained this in my book, which happened before their demonetization. And that's, you cause so much chaos, you just can't keep track of everything. They eventually just surrendered. And they said, we'll figure it out later, who's a criminal and who's not a criminal. But it's very hard to do. So no, I wouldn't strongly recommend that as something Pakistan should consider. I would recommend improving financial inclusion, having ways to provide very low cost or free debit accounts to poor individuals, which India has done, and many other countries. Japan has done that, the Nordic countries, many countries have done that. That's something I would advise. Of course, eventually, like everyone else, cash is going to become less and less important. But no, I absolutely would not advise radical demonetization. And I thought that was a mistake in India before they ever thought about it. And I certainly went and wrote that it was a mistake when it happened.
You have written a lot of things on central bank independence. You already mentioned in your the start of the talk that recently the Pakistan has formally announced the central bank independence. Would you think that this central bank independence will play a role in the digital economy or the current or in the scenario of the cryptocurrency and other things?
Central bank independence, when I first wrote about it, almost 40 years ago. It was 40 years ago. My gosh, now I wrote my first paper that really is my major paper, where there weren't many independent central banks, really just a couple at the time. And I suggested as a way of shielding the central bank from political pressures and therefore making it easier to get inflation down, to have a long view of what monetary policy should be. I have to say, when I wrote the paper, I had there was a lot of pushback against it. I couldn't get it published because people, said, well, how could this ever work? Where could you do this? But eventually, virtually every country in the world has moved very far in that direction. Many have independent central banks. And I think a piece of it I didn't anticipate was how successful it would be in developing economies and emerging markets. It has been spectacularly successful in lowering inflation, but you asked about cryptocurrencies, not just lowering inflation. I think it also has given central banks a degree of credibility, of a view that they have some technocratic expertise, that they've also been able to turn to other areas like bank regulation, financial regulation. And everyone looks to central banks on cryptocurrencies. They're not the whole game. The Treasury matters, the finance ministry matters, the government matters. There are a lot of laws that surround cryptocurrencies. But central banks, they have an important role to play. And also, I think they're trusted, more trusted than other authorities sometimes. And so I think it gives them an important role to play in regulation. That again, they can't do this by themselves. There are so many things cryptocurrencies touch on. I didn't mention tax law. When you buy and sell cryptocurrencies, how is it taxed? Many aspects of regulation. But for sure, having an independent central bank, I think it's a step towards strengthening the central bank's hand. Of course, independence. You're only independent as the government lets you be independent. Even in the United States, Congress could take away central bank independence in a week if it felt like it. It's not in the Constitution, but it's worked very well. And I think it would take a very powerful and aggressive autocrat president to try to take it away in the United States. I don't think it could be done. There are other countries where the central bank gets independent and it's not independent. It's something, the central bank has to fight for. But it's a good step, a very important step, to at least acknowledge legally that you would see it as an independent institution.
One question on debt. Joseph Stiglitz, once again, he said that the debt of the poor countries should be forgiven. What is your take on that? Because we can't pay debt now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually not far off from him again on this, but I would say it differently. There should be vast unconditional grants to the poorer countries in the world. I find it just hard to get my head wrapped around the fact that the amounts of money that the United States alone spent on handouts and stimulus. Just the last one in March was $1.9 trillion. Before that, there was $900 billion. Before that, there was $900 billion. And that's not even counting programs that are credit guarantees, mortgage forgiveness, all these things that add up to very large numbers also. How much did we contribute to the global vaccine, COVAX? I don't know what it is, $20 billion. And I also think there's other roles for aid. And one that I think is particularly important is and doable is the whole rich world thinks energy, green energy is important, protecting the climate's important. But of course, a lot of the change in energy demands coming from the fast-growing developing economies. And I think it would be, I've advocated creating a new world carbon bank to channel significant funds and expertise specifically along these lines, and I would say narrowly to help emerging markets wean themselves from coal, which I think has been, the low-hanging fruit in climate change. I think you could get support for large amounts of money, but in general, foreign aid just is not nearly large enough. I think foreign aid would be better than writing down debt, so you could use foreign aid to pay the debt. But I think giving foreign aid would be better because you could target it better, you could control it better. That said, I see a lot of debts being written down for the world's poorest countries as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a lot of countries borrowed more than they have ever. They're still in duress. I think the World Bank and the IMF have said that something like 60% of the poorest 70 countries in the world are in debt default or distress. There are a number of emerging markets. So we're going to see debt write-downs. And I guess I want to qualify what I said. I see nothing wrong with debt write-downs. I see nothing wrong where countries can't pay their debt. And rather than going through years of austerity, inflation, if you have to consider partial default as a serious option. It happens all the time. Countries do this all the time. And I think the advanced countries of the world in this situation after COVID-19 need to find ways to make that happen faster and more smoothly. And I'm also speaking of private debt. The private sector has not been forthcoming in writing down debt, but really the end game of COVID-19 is going to be a lot of debt write-downs. The average time for debt write-downs can be 5 to 7 years, and we need to have that happen much, much faster so countries can come out of the restructuring and be ready to grow again.
Great. Professor, last question. What would be the future of dollar? Because there is some discussion that the dollar will not be a dominant currency in the near future, and the renminbi, the Chinese renminbi, will be a dominant currency in the future. What is your take on that?
Well, we're talking about the near future, and let me say 10 years, no way the dollar is going to stay on top. Remarkably, the dollar has become more ascendant, more influential, more powerful over the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, there's things going on in geopolitics that could temper that, but I don't think it's just not easy to change. Coming back to the beginning of our conversation, where we talked about moving away from commercial banks, going straight to a central bank digital currency. Fine idea on paper, perhaps, but you can't do anything quickly. And I think moving away from the dollar is the same. I think if China aspires to be the global currency, that's a good aspiration. I think they need to do a lot of things to make that happen. We have to trust their laws. We have to trust that if you invest money in China, you're going to get treated fairly. They have to develop a very good reputation for that. If they're incentivized to do that, wonderful. I think that's good. If they don't achieve that, there are limits to how easily they can think about pulling even with the dollar, much less surpassing it.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful, wonderful conversation. It will be a very long life memory for me.
Academic colleagues in Pakistan, all the best wishes in their research and policy. And I also wish the best of luck to everyone in your country.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, viewers. This is end from for today. And next week, we will come with a new speaker on a new topic. Bye-bye.